Hello YouTube and welcome to the video about the isolated queen pawn. So isolated pawns, as you might know, are weak. If you don't know, I'll quickly explain to you later on why isolated pawns are weak, but the queen pawn has its own abbreviation, so it's not always weak. And why is that? Well, there's a lot of openings which lead to this structure. So it's been heavily played throughout the history of chess. And we're going to look at some very instructive games, both from the sides with the isolated pawn and those facing it, to try and understand how to navigate your own games when you are faced with this specific pawn structure, because it's such a common theme all across different openings that I think it's going to be useful for many of you. And hopefully by the end of this we will both understand a bit more about the isolated queen pawn, because I definitely learned a lot making this video, so I hope it will be the same for you. Alright, so this is the pawn structure that resembles the isolated queen pawn. So it's the d pawn that is isolated, the queen pawn on the d file, and generally speaking an isolated pawn is considered weak because it doesn't have support from a pawn right next to it, so therefore it should be quite easy to attack an isolated pawn. But for the queen pawn it's not so simple, because it's very dynamic and it generally comes with a lot of support. So the pawn itself covers c5, but more importantly e5. So white will quite easily be able to get a knight to e5, exerting a lot of pressure. There's also the diagonal from b1 to h7, creating a lot of potential pressure against the king. On top of that, there's the c file that is open, there's the e file that is open, and the queen or a rook from d1 can support the break. Because, I mean, if the pawn is able to get pushed to d5, the position tends to really break open into the favor of the side who has the isolated queen pawn. For the side from black's perspective in this case, d5 is an amazing blocking square, and you want to try to control this square as much as possible. And you don't really have a weak pawn like white has. So in the games we're going to review, we'll look at it from both the sides with or without the queen pawn, as I said, and at the end we'll summarize what I think are the main takeaways from this pawn structure. The first game we're going to have a look at is a World Championship match back in 1937 between Max Ilya and Alyakhin. So this game was played long before modern theory existed and long before engines also existed. That doesn't take away the key aspect as to why I want to show you this, just the opening phase of this game, because the dynamical options that come along with the isolated queen pawns is actually not to be underestimated. So these guys were insanely strong, of course. Even back then, they were playing well above Grandmaster level. But Max Ilya is actually going to mess up rather quickly in this position already. Black has the isolated d-pawn, which maybe was thought at that point to be sort of a weakness or like something that you shouldn't want to avoid. But actually the game is going to turn around rather quickly thanks to a lot of tactics and pressure that comes with this pawn. So let's see how it develops. After b4 we see already d4, attacking the knight, take the bishop, take the knight, and now all of a sudden the pawn on d5 ends up on c3. And we do see an inaccuracy with queen c2 here, and after queen a5 there's rook b1 and bishop d7 here, intending bishop a4, hitting the queen, pushing the pawn to c2, and this pawn is going to be a thorn into white's position. Already here, as you can see by the evaluation, black is slightly better. With the super precise play, I guess it's not the biggest of deals, but out of the opening, this is a disaster for white. We do see the move rook b3, and after bishop a4, the exchange is lost. I mean, the computer would like to play knight e2. But after knight d5, the pawn is firmly supported on c3, and black is already much better in any case. But after rook b3, bishop a4, we do see queen takes c3 for the moment. So if you take the queen, the rook is escaping the attack of the bishop. But after the nice queen d8, the rook can't move due to the mate on d1. And right out of the opening, black is going to win an exchange and is actually going to convert this game against a former world champion, Max Ilya. The next game we're going to go through from beginning to the end. And the reason I chose this is because it's going to show you what can happen if the side with the isolated pawn does not play dynamic and energetically. So this is a game from a long time ago, 1917. doesn't really matter for the sake of the video, but there was no real engines, and bishop d3 is not a move that would be played nowadays. But it's still a very instructive game nonetheless. So after a couple of moves, we now see that the position arises in which white has the isolated queen pawn. The problem for white here is that the d5 break is never really going to happen, because after knight b6, I mean, the battle for this square has been clearly won by black. There's 5 pieces that are able to look at this square, so therefore white doesn't really have the d5 break, and everything that black would want from an opening, they got. They got perfect development, they have firm control over d5 and no weaknesses. That being said, the game still can continue quite for both sides, but the problem here with white's approach is that after knight e4, black is very happily trading off some pieces. And already like that, 2 minor pieces disappeared. And the more pieces disappear, the more obvious this weak d4 pawn will get. And it's very instructive to see how Rubinstein actually converts this advantage. And I mean, he makes it look so simple, but it's not always that simple. But you don't always also have opponents that allow the trading down of pieces so, welcoming. So here we finally see that the pawn is blockaded by the knight, perfect square, and yeah, black is putting a lot of pressure, has nice rooks, the nice knight, and white is just sort of sitting behind its own pawn, trying not to lose it. But eventually, the black pressure will just overcomes white position, and black is going to convert. So after a couple of moves, we actually see black attacking a2, forcing b3. Queen drops back, so now the knight can jump in. Rook c1, knight d5 attacks the queen, and here comes a very nice move, queen f4. Again, offering more trades, because simplification will lead to an increase of black's advantage. After rook c2, we see a queen trade, we see a rook trade, and now comes a nice point, knight to b4, hitting the rook and the pawn, so the rook can't really leave the second rank. And after rook b2, black is now able to switch lanes and take control over the c-file, and after the rook infiltrates to a1, the a2 pawn is lost, and all of a sudden we reach a technical winning position for black, which after a couple of accurate moves is easily converted. And after this position, yeah, they resign. So I mean, if you want to go through the analysis, because it looks so simple, right? I mean, white was just a bit passive. They allowed an isolated d-pawn, traded some pieces, and then boom, all of a sudden, lost. And that's exactly what happens if you don't play carefully enough. All right, so the next game we're going to look at is a game between Karpov and Ullmann. So this game was played a bit later in 1973, still quite some time ago. But black understood a bit better already now what to do in case of an isolated pawn. So we see the French variation. We see the French defense in the Tarrasch variation, and after it takes on c5, the so-called isolated queen pawn structure comes about. Short castles, knight e7, knight b3, attacks the bishop, but more importantly, just like in the other game, white is taking full control over this d4 square. Both knights are there to guard it, the queen is here, there's the possibility of c3 as well, so white has a lot of control over this square. Black will not be able to push this pawn. But black is also not going to easily trade off a lot of pieces as well. So we just see some developing moves, which I don't want to go into too much detail about. But after queen b6, we now see that the knight from f3 is blockading the pawn on d4. And this is, of course, the perfect square for the knight. It blockades the pawn and also attacks a lot of squares on the black side. So as mentioned, black is just not going to trade down pieces because they know at this point that trading down means that the d5 pawn will become weaker and weaker in the endgame. So let's see how Karpov actually squeezes out an advantage. So we just see some more developing move. The bishop drops back to open up the rook. Bishop goes to e4 to close off the file. Bishop g3, offering a trade of bishop, which is probably forced because they do take. H-take, always capture towards the center, and that's the first minor pieces that have been traded. I mean, a5, nice move, trying to kick away the knight. Karpov says no, and here black decides to do trade on the center of the board, and knight c6. Because, I mean, if black doesn't trade, they are a bit cramped here, and this allows the knight go to c6, and the rook is now on an open file as well. and after bishop b5, pinning the knight, we do see that the rook sidesteps, g4 comes, and here black decides to take on d4, basically saying, okay, you have to also get an isolated d-pawn. So the dynamic changes here. The isolated d-pawn is no longer, I mean, it's still isolated, but white has one as well. The problem here for white is, for black, as you can see in the evaluation as well, is that this pawn is on a light square. The bishop on e4 is easily kicked away, and white is just a bit more active and has the potential attack on this pawn. So therefore white's already slightly better, even though they also have an isolated d-pawn now as well. After a rook c8, f3, bishop g6, the white rook infiltrates to the 7th rank, attacking the pawn on b7, but after the pawn moves to b6, we now see rook e1, doubling up on the e file. h6 makes some luft for the king, rook b7, attacks the pawn, rook d6, boom boom. Rooks are now infiltrated on the 7th rank, and the only thing white needs to do is play f4, f5, kick away the bishop, and f7 drops. So after h5, takes, g4, bishop g6, f4, creating a huge threat of f5. Black's position is about to collapse. I mean, it's hard to give advice here already for black. The evaluation also plus 1.3, so it's just super difficult for black to play as a human. The computer wanted bishop b4, allowing rook f7. I mean, yeah, of course, if you know the engine moves, then it makes a bit more sense. But after the rook gives a couple of checks, the king goes to the center of board, and now we see bishop b4. The f7 pawn is lost, rook g6, and some small inaccuracies, but the result of this game will never change, as we'll see in a couple of moves when this game fizzles out after a check and rook d7, rook e7. Now g6 is going to come, the pawns are going to march, and yeah, black's completely winning. White's completely winning. So this is a very famous and known game from Karpov. You can find it also on Lichess in the master database, and it's instructive to see how first Karpov was able to take full control over the square in front of the isolated pawn, firmly blockading it. And then after bishop g3, some minor pieces were traded off. And then later on, in this position, the isolated queen pawn got transformed into both having isolated d-pawn, but white is better here due to the fact that this pawn is on a light square and the rooks are able to infiltrate and the bishop's going to get kicked back. So everything like this was understood by Karpov, and therefore he allowed this trade or change of structure, and actually flawlessly converted a very, very nice game. So the next game we're going to look at is also a game of Karpov, but this time with the black pieces against Vasily Smyslov. And you will see very soon that it is white who has the isolated pawn. But by now you might think, isolated pawns, that must be quite bad, right? Because, yeah, you just blockade the pawn, trade pieces, and you win the endgame. Well, it's not always that simple, especially if white's able to put up a lot of pressure, and it's not going to be so simple nowadays. So as we'll see in this game, it's actually white with the isolated pawn that is going to win this game, thanks to a lot of dynamical aspect and threats and tactics that you will see throughout. So after we just finish our development, at some point we will see the idea of this pawn being pushed. And there's already a slight difference here, right? Because if you look at the position, black is not firmly controlling d5 like it is in the other games. There's the knight, the pawn, and the queen here. But white also has a queen and a knight behind it. The rook is already on e1, putting some pressure potentially on e7, so there will be tactics here. First, we'll see queen d3, setting up the potential mate on h7, currently defended by the knight, rook c8, bishop g5, and inaccuracy, doesn't matter too much, g6, rook a d1, knight to d5. Offering, of course, the trades, and yeah, white is not going to trade down all the pieces and reach a worse endgame. Of course not. So after bishop h6, the rook's attacked, the rook goes to e8, and bishop a4. So the big difference here is white keeping pieces on the board, exerting pressure, pinning stuff. The rooks are very well placed, the queen and knight. I mean, everything looks pretty nice here for white. The valuation is still equal because the game is in balance. But yeah, it's not so simple for black to exploit this isolated pawn. So let's see, we see a6, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, queen e3. And all of a sudden, the valuations also went up, but there's no stopping bishop b3 and d5. And after bishop f6, bishop d3, the queen is attacked. It needed to go to d7 to form the most resilient defense. But yeah, this is considered a huge blunder. But let's quickly see. I mean, if queen to d7, there would also be d5. And if we switch on the engine real quick here, after pawn takes hitting the queen, queen takes b6, we can see that white has very nice rooks. The bishop's there, the knight, like every piece that white has is looking very, very good. This bishop is kind of sad here. I mean, this rook is decent. The pawn also is now isolated, so could be weak. And white has huge pressure on black's position. With correct play, of course, the game can still continue. But as with human games, it's just going to be errors from the side who is under the most pressure. That's usually what happens. So we do see queen h5, and here comes the tactical blow d5. So, important moment is to always be aware of tactics when you have the isolated pawn. Obviously, if black were to take, let me switch off the engine because that makes, I mean, it gives everyone a sense of that, like, it's just not fair to analyze with the engine on, because then the computer just gives you the answers, and I don't think you're really learning as much. So clearly, yeah, you can't take due to the back rank mate here, like I just showed. That's checkmate. Bishop also is there. So after d5, knight went to d8, and now comes d6. And it's considered a blunder. It's fine, it's not. White is still much better here. And there's a huge threat of d7, hitting both rooks. Rook c5, still d7, rook is here. So notice how with the, thanks to a little tactical moment, d5 was pushed, and now the pawn is already on d7. Again, a thorn in the side of black's position, one square away of promoting and taking away squares for the rooks, and it's just very, very annoying to deal with. We see queen f4. Boom, that was the idea. Infiltrating on the back rank. Threatening queen d8 check, picking up the rook. They take there, queen takes here, bishop f8, and now the very calm rook e3, not allowing bishop f3 and doubling the pawns, and there's no stopping what's going to happen next. Queen f8, it's not an inaccuracy, and queen d8, or pawn d8, queen, and yeah, white simply up a full piece for the isolated d pawn. So this pawn just ran all the way up the board, and it was all because of this moment of d5. The next game we're going to look at is from Garry Kasparov against Nigel Short. So as you all know, Kasparov was known for its very dynamical play and just like one of the greatest of all time. And in this game, you're going to show how white, who will get an isolated d-pawn, is going to handle the position. So after we see the opening of a queen's gambit decline, pawn takes there, e5, h3, and here we see the structure in which white has the isolated pawn. And initially I would think, black has the bishop pair, black has a better pawn structure, black's better, right? No, because the bishop is able to control d5, the knight is here, the queen is there, and the problem here for black is also that this guy is rather, I mean, wouldn't say weak, but it doesn't really have great squares. They tried to, Nigel Short tries to get it out, so knight b6 hits the bishop, bishop drops back, bishop goes to f5, rook e1, bishop g5, and rook a1. Very nice move. Doesn't want to take the bishop on g5, but simply goes to a1, says, okay, let me just hold a minute, and maybe push the pawn to a5, and yeah, this is actually a pretty decent position for white to be in. We see knight d7. And after that, this allows the pawn break d5. I mean, obviously, I don't think knight d7 should have been played, but I guess There were reasons why Nigel short played this, much more stronger than me. I guess they wanted to stop knights to e5, right? Because the pawn on d4 supports this pawn. There could be rook e5 ideas as well. So Nigel went knight to d7, controlling this square, but in return allows d5. And immediately after d5, we see already an inaccuracy. Rook to c8. Knight jumps to d4. All of a sudden, the square that was occupied by the pawn now comes available for a knight, gets a tempo on the bishop. Bishop has to drop back. And here we see another very, very nice move, knight to e6. Wow. So yeah, this pawn allows a lot of dynamical options and a lot of tactics. I mean, knight e6 on itself is not so hard to see because it's a fork on the queen and rook. So you have to take, and now pawn takes. It hits the knight, plus there's a huge threat of e7 with a discovery check winning the queen. So the king has to sidestep. And here already, white wins back the piece. And all of a sudden, the pawn from d4 ends up on e6 and becomes a huge problem for black to deal with. Black does deal with it, but the problem is that after queen to g4, there's too many threats. And it will be threat after threat after threat until black just collapses. For the moment, you can't take on e7 because of the rook on c8. That would be loose. So let's say bishop e7, you can just take that bishop, rook takes, and then queen to c8. So you can't take e7. So queen c5 comes, and now we see knight e4 hitting the queen. And after queen takes e7, stepping into this pin, black does take the pawn. But why does white allow that? Well, let's see how Kasparov transforms this advantage. First, bishop goes back to c2. Discovery also, or eyeballing the king on h7. Rook goes to f8 and g3. And the problem here is that black literally has no good moves. The position is hopeless. Like, there's nothing to do. h4 is going to come, and you can't really stop it. If you take here, that's kind of bad in view of, well, there's rook takes, there's bishop takes. But it's just like hopeless. I can check with the engine because I don't know exactly all the lines. But if you play g3 here, there's just no good moves to recommend. I mean, this just hits the queen and sets up a discovery against the king. Like, it's just impossible to find any move here that keeps the game going. Nigel does try with the queen to d8, but after rook d1 hitting the queen, queen to a5, and now h4, the game is basically over. And we'll see a nice conclusion to this game with knight to c3. Yeah, giving away this bishop, but also hitting it on e7. And now the rook is infiltrating. The mate's coming on g7, rook g8. And now both rooks enter as well. Just like in the Karpov game, white transforms his dynamical advantage into a lot of pressure against the king. Bishop f5. And after rook g7, king h8, queen d4. It's over. So super dynamical game, and a lot of tactics that went under the radar a little bit that I probably haven't touched upon too much. But the main key point was that the d5 break happened, and once that happened, a lot of tactics were coming about. So yeah, in this isolated queen pawn video, I hope that you learned something more about the dynamical options of this pawn structure. And to summarize, I would think that if you have a isolated pawn, then you want to be able to keep the piece on the board, develop your pieces, of course, and try to play dynamically and be super aware of the tactical option of pushing that pawn, because that will give you some real attacking chances. And if you have the side who has to play against the isolated pawn, then the d5 square or the d4 square, the square in front of the pawn is like very important to control, to never allow this break. And if you have the chance to trade down into an endgame, it's very likely that this is a very good thing for you to do. So thank you so much for watching it to the end. I really hope you enjoyed. And if you like this content, please consider subscribing or watch the next video.